Dear Dr. Parthasarathy Shom, you've been handed a gigantic task. Now, many believe GAAR is a necessity in this day and age of multi-jurisdictional business operations, financial complexity, and aggressive planning. But no business in this country wants an anti-avoidance law, and definitely not the kind of GAAR that's currently taking shape in India. So to your committee falls the task of implementing a more humane GAAR, a fair, less ambiguous GAAR, and a GAAR that doesn't scare away legitimate investment. Now, you said you will be studying what other countries have done. And so we thought we'd bring you, on this special edition of The Firm, experiences of the oldest and one of the youngest anti-avoidance regimes in the world. Here goes. Ever since the Duke of Westminster case, revenue authorities across the world have been trying to unravel the tangled strings that connect tax planning and tax avoidance. Specific transgressions have been curtailed by specific anti-avoidance rules, but creative tax planning has always been a step ahead. And so in 1988, Canada became the first country to introduce a General Anti-Avoidance Rule, or GAAR. It was prospective, including a grandfathering clause, and aimed at preventing artificial tax avoidance agreements. Canada's GAAR applies to transactions, alone or part of a series, that result in a tax benefit that cannot reasonably have been undertaken for bona fide purposes other than that tax benefit, and that can reasonably be considered to result in a misuse or abuse of other tax provisions.
But notice the word reasonably. This is an objective test. It is reasonable to conclude that the transaction was primarily tax motivated. So it is not a subjective test. I notice there's been some discussion in the Indian context about whether the purpose test is subjective because it doesn't use this word, whether it's reasonable to conclude. One can say, well, yes, you could have achieved those business purposes, but in a much more direct way through other kinds of transactions. Then a court will say, well, it's not reasonable to conclude that this was primarily not tax motivated, and therefore the GAAR could apply. Your draft rule defines an arrangement to include steps in a transaction. Now, from a Canadian perspective, we think of a transaction as singular, which is why we have a rule that says that the GAAR applies if a transaction or a transaction as part of a series results in a tax benefit. So in our system, a transaction is only one thing. In your system, the way that you've defined arrangement suggests that a transaction can be a composite. Again, I'm not sure if that's the case, but it's something to pay attention to.
The US enacted the Doctrine of Economic Substance, or the ESD, as recently as 2010. Under it, a transaction has substance if it changes in a meaningful way the taxpayer's economic position besides the tax effect, and if there is a substantial purpose for entering the transaction.
A taxpayer may rely on profit potential to satisfy both prongs of the conjunctive analysis required by the ESD. But there is no minimum profit or minimum rate of return that the taxpayer needs to demonstrate. Instead, what the law says is profit potential or change in the economic position of the taxpayer will be considered by comparing the pre-tax profit that the taxpayer stands to gain from undertaking the transaction to the present value of the tax benefits. And the pre-tax profit has to be substantial in comparison to the tax savings. So it is not as if the taxpayer is precluded from realizing tax savings from undertaking a transaction. You have to show that there is something else over and above the federal tax savings that accrues to the taxpayer, and that has to be fairly substantial. It is not a defined term, so one could argue what substantial means.
Since the ESD was a codification of common law and not a new law, it spared 4 types of commonly used transactions, such as the choice of capitalizing via debt or equity, making a foreign investment via a domestic or foreign corporation, reorganizations, and related party transactions. The US ESD was applied prospectively and does not allow for advance rulings. India's GAAR is quite different from the US economic substance doctrine. Some say it's a mix of Canadian and South African GAARs. 2 key design principles are already enshrined in the Finance Act 2012. a 4-part test to determine if a transaction is permissible, and a 3-part commercial substance test. The more recent draft guidelines distinguish between tax mitigation and tax avoidance and offer 21 illustrations of when GAAR could or could not apply.
I think 2-3 things immediately come to mind in terms of the design of the Indian GAAR. One is, unlike maybe Canada or US, we are talking here of not the main purpose being a tax benefit, but even one of the main purposes being for tax benefit. That's one, which is very unique, I think. The other is, there is the second requirement or condition, which has 4 alternatives, and that makes things extremely wide and broad for the revenue to act on. So we have not only the misuse or abuse of the law test, which I guess is there in Canada as well, and probably to some extent is derived in the US as well. But when it comes to the other 3 tests, we see them missing. So the commercial substance, the bona fide purpose, or the fact that the transaction is not at arm's length.
The 4-part test, if you will, in terms of where the Indian rules look to see whether or not there was an abusive purpose or a related party transaction, those things, we don't have that significant a level of detail in the US ESD rules. The US ESD rules simply have a 2-part test that would say, okay, did the taxpayer have a business purpose? Did they have economic substance to undertake the transaction? So it's a simpler test in that sense.
So I think among Commonwealth countries there are a lot of similarities in the GAARs. First of all, we share the origin of this Duke of Westminster case that was really the inspiration for why GAARs have been introduced in many Commonwealth countries. Canada has had 3 aspects to its GAAR that India has followed elements of them, but with some differences. One, the idea of a tax benefit, which is in the Indian GAAR very similar to the Canadian language. Secondly, the requirement of a tax purpose or tax-motivated transaction, which is also similar to the Canadian GAAR. Where the Indian version departs from the Canadian GAAR is the third aspect of the Canadian GAAR focuses solely on misuse or abuse. And so there's a question of whether you violated the spirit of the Act while adhering to the words of the Act. India has that element, but then has added on these other so-called 4 tests, one of which is a broad commercial substance test, which doesn't appear in the Canadian GAAR and doesn't appear in most other GAARs that you see in the Commonwealth world. The English draft GAAR, for example, is a more narrowly targeted GAAR focused on abuse like the Canadian GAAR.
You made the point that India has a substance test with other GAARs don't necessarily share. What are the consequences of trying to test substance, as the Indian GAAR attempts to do?
Well, I guess it depends on what you're aspiring to accomplish in your GAAR. I think the GAAR that we have in Canada is really plays a very residual role. We have a number of specific anti-avoidance rules, lay out the scheme of the Act, and the GAAR is there as a backstop for things that couldn't have been contemplated, that taxpayers designed clever ways around the rules. Here it seems to me as though the focus on commercial substance is attempting to do a lot more.
I would echo Professor Duff's sentiments in the sense that the U.S. already has a number of rules, the Controlled Foreign Corporation rules, PFIC rules, other types of anti-abuse provisions that specifically target certain types of transactions. So when the U.S. economic substance doctrine came into play, it focused on transactions that were not necessarily covered by these rules, so it was more of a residual test. Whereas the way I understand the Indian GAAR rules, it could be wielded to basically attack a number of different types of transactions. And so I think that's a fundamental difference between the two systems.
The commercial substance test is further widened by saying in certain situations it will be deemed that there is lack of commercial substance. So we are in a matter of GAAR where we are saying that we have to look at commercial substance. Is there scope to say that in certain situations it will be deemed to lack commercial substance? Commercial substance is something which one has to look at under the general principles of whether there is a business reason. Right. You can't deem something to lack a business reason if there actually is one. There shouldn't be a fiction created around that.